These giants that live up to 634 years were once so plentiful that a person could travel from the Atlantic shore to Minnesota and seldom be out of sight of them. For thousands of years, Minnesota's white pine forest was home to caribou, pine martens, and dozens of colorful birds like pine grosbeaks and red crossbills. The forest seemed destined to last for centuries. When cutting began, white pines larger than any in Minnesota today were common. White pines up to 6 feet in diameter and over 150 feet tall. The rule for good forestry is to cut trees no faster than the forest grows new ones. This is called sustainable forestry. It's the only way to produce wood and keep our forests and wildlife, and jobs in the timber industry. In Minnesota, white pines have always been cut at unsustainable rates, and we've nearly lost our white pine forests and our white pine industry. The rush to cut white pine started on the Atlantic coast. White pine wood was America's favorite building material. Loggers cut their way west through Michigan and Wisconsin to the vast white pine forests of Minnesota. Minnesota had 3.5 million acres of white pine forest and mixed white and red pine forest, shown here in red. The whole square represents the total forest area of Minnesota, over 27 million acres before cutting began. The red portion is the area dominated by white pines, and the green portion represents other forest types, including young white pine forests and forests with only scattered white pines. People thought that Minnesota's white pine forests were inexhaustible, and the forest did support a booming industry for almost 100 years. But in 1932, the white pine industry collapsed. All the large white pine forests have been cut, including those in the Boundary Waters Canoe area. Most of the sawmills closed, and unemployment reached 70% in northern Minnesota logging communities. People needed jobs, so they continued cutting the remnants of the white pine forest, seeking out smaller and smaller white pine forests, and even cutting the lone white pine scattered through other types. This continues even today. The problem is that the white pines usually did not grow back. Nearly all of them were cut, and less than 2% grew back. These graphs illustrate what happened to Minnesota forests between the time cutting began in 1837 and the time of the most recent forest survey in 1990. The big squares again represent the total forested area of Minnesota, and we can see that the total forest shrank only 38% as we turned some of it into cities and farms. But our white pine forest, shown in red, shrank 98%. Only 67,000 acres remain. Very few of the old trees remain. The 2% we have left is mostly the 2% that grew back after cutting. So these are not the majestic white pines we once had. Most of them are only 60 to 120 years old. That is, only 60 to 120 years into their 400-year life cycle. They're teenagers in human years. They're only about a quarter grown, and they're being cut. But this graph shows something even more ominous than the fact that there aren't many older white pines left. It shows there aren't enough younger white pines to replace the teenagers. So if we cut very many of the teenagers, white pines will continue to decline in Minnesota, unless we get a lot better at helping them reproduce. White pines used to thrive in Minnesota. Why aren't there more young white pines today? What caused that change is a story of good intentions and unforeseen consequences. What happened was that in the 1800s, good, sincere people were supplying lumber to a growing America and clearing the land for agriculture. And it seemed more logical in those days to cut every tree they could rather than leaving seed trees for the future. The forest might have grown back anyway from little white pine seedlings that had a good start on the forest floor. No one realized, though, that their harvest methods would kill those seedlings. Branches were trimmed from entire forests and left to dry out and become fuel. The result was huge, unnatural forest fires that killed the seedlings and hundreds of people. The Hinckley Fire, the Cloquet Fire, and others. People needed protection, so they passed a law that branches had to be burned before they dried out. This made it safer and helped clear the land for farms, but it meant that wherever the big trees were cut, the seedlings would be burned up. Years passed. People tried farming the cleared areas, but one by one the farms failed and the people moved away. The land started to become forest again, but not usually white pine forest. The big white pines that were needed for seed were mostly gone. Fluffy aspen seeds that can blow for miles started the Northwoods of today, a forest that is often too dense for young white pines to survive. The new forest changed our wildlife too. Caribou disappeared and were replaced by white-tailed deer, which eat white pine seedlings. People began to realize that the white pines that had provided a living for so long would not come back without help. So forestry agencies were created to protect and restore the forests. But no one had tried to grow white pines before, so there was no way the foresters could know that what they were doing to help was only making things worse. They worked hard and planted over 25 million white pine seedlings in Minnesota, which would have been great except that they brought the seedlings from Europe and introduced European white pine blister rust to America. The disease had its worst effects anywhere in the nation, right here in northeastern Minnesota, where cool, moist summers make white pines especially susceptible. Blister rust does not spread from tree to tree, so it's not necessary to cut infected trees to protect the forest. But worries about this disease led foresters a half-century ago to make a bad decision. They decided to stop planting white pines, even healthy ones, but to go on cutting them. That policy of cutting white pines without replanting them has continued until recently, and it's the biggest reason why there are so few white pines today, and a major reason why there are so few young white pines. It's not the only reason, though. A half-century ago, when foresters were deciding not to plant white pines, they were also doing something they did not realize would make it harder for natural seedlings. They were protecting the forest from fire. This kept fires from spreading and kept seedlings from being burned up, but it also made fires unnaturally infrequent, which let litter and underbrush become so dense on the forest floor that it became hard for white pine seedlings to find soil and light. No one knew yet that natural ground fire actually helps white pines reproduce. The fire burns up leaf litter and underbrush on the forest floor, while the mature white pines are protected by their thick bark. The fire creates ideal conditions for the next crop of white pine seeds to take root and survive. Young white pines now have 4 problems that people helped create: being eaten by deer in winter, being killed by blister rust, too much litter on the forest floor due to fire prevention, and too much shade due to fire prevention. Is it important to keep white pines for wildlife? U.S. Forest Service studies showed that as scarce as white pines are, they still hold 80% of the eagle nests and 77% of the osprey nests in the Superior National Forest. These birds seek out white pines that strongly. Why do these birds prefer the white pine on the right here over the red pine in the middle? Probably because white pines grow taller, have sturdier branches for heavy nests, and have bigger gaps between branches for birds with 6-foot wingspans. Eagle and osprey populations are still recovering from DDT pesticide problems, and they'll need more and more white pines as they increase their breeding areas. Smaller birds also use white pines. Over half the 141 woodland bird species in the northeastern United States live in habitats that include white pines. Scattered lone white pines provide different wildlife values than do white pine forests. Both were components of Minnesota's pre-settlement forests, and both are important to wildlife. For example, scattered white pines are important to black bears. U.S. Forest Service researchers who lived with wild bears observed that mother bears seemed to know every old white pine in their territories, and the mothers arranged their activities around those trees. They slept next to them with their cubs at night, passing up thousands of other trees to sleep next to a big white pine. They left their cubs at the bases of them when they went off to forage because the cubs could safely climb to escape danger. The mothers seemed to know that the strong, rough bark on old white pines was the safest for cubs to climb. When cubs are small, they often fall from trees with flaky bark like red pines, jack pines, and this spruce. And they often fall from trees with smooth bark like birches and aspens. For example, this cub fell when she climbed higher onto the smooth bark of this aspen. The same thing happened to her 2 brothers. The mother tried to stop them, and here is trying to pull one down. The cubs were okay, though, and the mother led them to the nearest old white pine. When cubs have to stay up trees for hours to escape danger, it's important in spring in northern Minnesota that the tree be a white pine that can give shade instead of a deciduous tree that doesn't have any leaves yet. Because even on cool days, the sun can make cubs' black fur so hot that they can die if they can't find shade. No other tree can replace the values that white pines have to a variety of wildlife in northern Minnesota. One of their special values is that they often become hollow like this one, and make homes for larger wildlife than does any other northern tree. In winter, dens in hollow trees are warmer, drier, and safer than ground dens, so they're preferred by many large animals like bears, raccoons, and porcupines. But big hollow trees like this one are rare in northern forests because we almost always cut them before they get this big. Even dead or dying white pines are important to wildlife. A healthy forest is a functioning ecosystem that includes dead and dying trees for wildlife homes and food. For example, dying white pines are the favorites of pileated woodpeckers. The woodpeckers make holes that later become homes for other wildlife, including owls, flying squirrels, kestrels, and wood ducks. A special value of a home in a white pine is that it's long-lasting. Dead white pines remain standing for up to a half-century, which is about 10 times longer than most dead trees stand in northern forests. A special value of the bark on dead white pines is that when it begins to separate from the trunk, it creates a space that's an ideal place for bats to give birth and raise their young. The dark bark on a trunk that towers above the other trees absorbs sunlight and becomes warm. In winter, birds take advantage of spaces under the bark for sleeping. Dead white pines provide homes and food for as many animals and birds as do live ones. Dead white pines are special because they have just the right amount of branches for big birds to land on without hitting their wings on other branches, and they tower over the other trees so birds can watch for danger and food while they rest. When a white pine finally does fall, it becomes valuable in a new way. Unlike smaller logs that quickly dry out and disintegrate, big white pine logs stay moist and provide habitat for up to 2 centuries. They provide habitat for uncommon mosses, rare fungi, salamanders, red-bellied snakes, insects, and a variety of other animals. As the log begins to crumble into the forest floor, it gives a final gift to the forest. It becomes the best place for a new white pine to take root. The dead white pine nourishes a new forest giant to take its place. Earlier this century, Minnesota had beautiful forests of yellow birch, also called silver birch. These were the largest and most valuable hardwoods in our northern forests. People watched quietly and trustingly as foresters allowed the silver birch forest to be cut and the silver birch industry to disappear. We must speak up for our white pine heritage for its beauty, future timber value, and wildlife value before it's too late.